I'm Michael Fox, and this is the Prospector News Podcast. And I have joining me today a longtime friend, Ryan Sistad, a Better in Our Backyard. Welcome back to the show, Ryan.
Thank you for having me on, Michael. I appreciate it. Always a pleasure.
Yeah, it's good. I like having your perspective on what's going on in the United States as far as, what the government says versus what the government does. And you provide some good insights to that. So before we get right into the meat and potatoes of this discussion, let's tell people what Better in Our Backyard is and what you guys do.
Well, thank you, Michael. Yeah, so Better in Our Backyard is a pro-responsible industrial development group. We advocate for projects in Minnesota, Idaho, Arizona, Michigan, and Wisconsin. So we're on the verge of going national. And when we say responsible industrial development, what we mean is we advocate for projects and industries that we believe are critical to growing local economies or regional economies, while also those companies or set projects are still adhering to strict environmental standards where the environment is still going to be protected. And we represent Enbridge in the oil and gas sector, which is a Canadian company. And then we also represent other companies like Resolution Copper out of Arizona, Perpetua Resources out of Idaho, Talon Metals out of Minnesota, New Range Copper Nickel out of Minnesota, and Twin Metals Minnesota out of obviously Minnesota. So we do some oil and gas work, but the reason why you and I are talking today is we've really hit our stride or hit a niche, if you will, within the advocacy community as it pertains to the mining industry.
Yeah, and we actually had a bit of good news in the last 7-10 days. The co-sponsored bill by Senator Manchin and Senator Barraza of Wyoming, Senator Manchin of West Virginia, cleared some hurdles in the Senate and looks like it's going to move forward. So what can you tell me about the bill and why is it so important to the permitting reform movement in the United States?
Well, number one, the cool thing about it is that it is a bipartisan effort. Senator Manchin being, well, he's now an independent, but a Democrat, but we also have a couple senators out of Nevada that support it. And then this was also co-sponsored by John Barrasso, who's a Republican. So this is a bipartisan effort. Permitting reform is becoming a popular talking point on both sides of the aisle in the U.S. So right now it's gone through committee on the House or the Senate committee, on energy and natural resources. And now it's going to be put up for a vote in the Senate, which personally I expect to pass or hopes that it passes so that it can reach the House and then eventually get on the president's desk. And so the whole point of the bill is that it aims to streamline project timelines and limit legal challenges. And this is something that's been in the works for the last couple of years. It's not a huge step forward, if you will, when it comes to, permitting timelines. One example being, a few weeks ago, the S&P released, a study that it takes up to 29 years between the discovery of a deposit and actually bringing a mine into production in the U.S., which is second largest or second longest in the world, which that needs to be improved on. And, you're not going to see a huge, shift in that timeline period, if you will. But I would say like the biggest thing to take away from this, assuming it were to pass in the Senate, is that basically it's giving a 150-day limit for judicial review of agencies' decisions. One example being that, let's say if the U.S. Forest Service issues a permit for Perpetua Resources Stibnite Gold Project out of Idaho. It would give a 150-day limit for NGOs to say file a lawsuit to challenge the permit, and then it also give a limit for the judiciary to actually make a decision on if the permit being issued was legal or not. From my understanding, anyway, I'm not a legal expert by any means, but that's what I take from the bill, and that in itself, I would argue, is a huge step forward, given that there are some projects that we've seen across the country, including New Range Copper Nickel's North Met project, that have received all the permits, only for one of their permits to get revoked after being challenged in the court. So that in itself is a win, but there's still a heck of a lot more work to do on a federal level here in the U.S.
Yeah, I like the fact that it's for Senator Manchin. It's part of the legacy he wants to leave behind, and with him retiring at the end of this this seating of the Senate and the government there, he's he's got the motivation to try and get this across the finish line before for the next Congress takes hold in January. The other thing, and this was my Canadian ignorance. I first found out about the challenges. Like I assumed that the way we do things in Canada would be kind of similar to the way you guys do things down in the United States, and I was really shocked to find that where in Canada, if you apply for the permit, anybody that has objections to that permit has to step up prior to them issuing the permit to raise their objections and to work through any issues that may come from those objections. Whereas in the United States, I was shocked to find out that the actual issuing of the permit was like the firing of a starter's pistol. And that's when everybody starts coming out of the woodwork to sue as to why they don't think you should have been given the permit in the first place.
Yeah, I mean, it's you would think that common sense would tell you that we should have the permit in place once the permit is issued, because we do have public comment periods for, where we, kind of similar to what you just said with Canada, where you have local communities have the opportunity, other groups give their input on why a company should or shouldn't get a permit. However, unfortunately, just where it sits right now is that, there's still an opportunity for a permit to revoke even after public comments, and even after if a company can prove that they can meet the strict environmental standards in front of them. So yeah, it's heavy on both ends of it. The game's not over by any means in the US once you get your permit.
No, and the other thing that I found really kind of remarkable about the way things are done there currently is that, if an NGO wants to challenge your permit, they can challenge on one aspect of it. They may win, they may lose. If they lose, then they could turn around and challenge that permit yet again based on another aspect of it. And these legal challenges could take years to wind their way through the court off of the same permit, because they could just simply keep hammering on different elements of the permit. It reminded me of the old IRA statement, back in the 1970s when they tried to assassinate Margaret Thatcher, and they said, she has to be lucky every time. We only need to be lucky once, and that seems to be the strategy of the NGOs down there. And I think this permitting reform limits their ability to do that. So if they have any objections, they have 150 days to raise them all in one fell swoop. Is that the way you understand it?
That's how I understand it on my end. And basically, it limits the ability to what you just said the NGOs can do, like, because their strategy is death by a thousand cuts, right? Just delay, delay, delay. It's not necessarily that we win in revoking the permit. It's more that how can we delay this project to a certain point where a company will just simply go away, is essentially their strategy. And I would say where the huge positive about this permit, if it's a success through the Senate and the House, and if it becomes law, is that it basically limits that strategy.
Yeah. Now, the other part of this that I grabbed a hold of when I was reading through what was proposed in the legislation was not only was there a 150-day statute of limitations on filing appeals to the permit, they're trying to speed the judiciary up in hearing those objections and ruling on them, so that this doesn't kind of continue on ad nauseum forever.
Essentially, yes, because a lot of companies are left in the dark on when the judiciary is actually going to make a decision. And so with this deadline, it gives an opportunity for the company to better plan, on what they're going to do. I mean, it's, for the most part, companies really do not know when a judiciary is going to make a decision. And with this 150-day timeline, it basically, knows that, okay, let's say if something happens in October, they know that a decision is going to be made by January, February. They're not going to wait another year before they hear of something, or even longer in some cases. So, this is a huge win.
Now, under the old mechanism, one of your clients actually had a permit revoked that set their company back years. And it was a considerable length of time after the permit was received that they had it revoked. Can you tell me a little bit more about that story?
Yeah, that was New Range Copper Nickels North Met project. We still represent them. They're one of our founding partners at Better in Our Backyard. But basically, they had a 404 wetlands permit revoked last year in June of 2023, and that was a permit that they already had for years. And it was just they randomly got a call one day saying you no longer have this permit without really much notice before it became public. So this is a real issue in the U.S. and as it pertains to projects in Minnesota. And so I would argue this is probably, NorthMet project's a great case study on why this legislation is so key. And I agree with you that, in terms of what you're saying with Senator Manchin, is that this is a heck of a thing for him and for his legacy to put a real stamp on his career in the Senate if this becomes a success.
So then, with the permitting reform from Manchin and Bursa, that should solve that problem. And when you have a permit, you actually have a permit, and you don't have to be constantly looking over your shoulder, wondering if someday someone's going to take that away from you. But beyond that, that's kind of leading up. There's an impetus because of Manchin's retirement to get this across the finish line. But most of the other stuff that you guys are working on, it seems to me is it's going to be wait until after the election to see what happens. Is it not?
A little bit, yeah. Especially with some of these projects, I think it's pretty. With one potential administration, we kind of understand what probably is going to happen, and then it's with the current one, or I would say kind of the current administration, right? Let's say if VP Harris wins the election, it's going to be a little bit of the old and a little bit of new administration, but it's kind of hard to know from my perspective anyway, what the mining industry would look like under a Harris and say Waltz administration. I know the Biden administration, they've had some negatives when it comes to the mining aspect of it here in the U.S., but there's also been some positives. The Department of Defense has done a great job of awarding monies to critical mineral projects across the country. Most recently, they announced funding to Lithium Americas for their Thacker Pass project in northern Nevada. But, and then we also have the case of Twin Metals, where their mineral leases were basically taken away from them within a year and a half of, President Biden taking office. So there's some goods and there's some bads. And, and then with potentially reelecting or having President Trump come back in, there's a good chance that the mineral leases for Twin Metals would come back, right? Resolution Copper out of Arizona would stand probably, they would probably go through the permitting process a little bit quicker. And I'm not speaking for them when I say that. This is just from what I've read and what I've looked through. And so yeah, it's definitely a little bit of a wait and see. And I'm curious to see what, as time goes on too, as we work through these campaigns. I will be curious to see how Harris and Waltz feel about certain projects across the country.
Yeah, it's kind of a murky color going in. Like in past, it's, you always had one side that seemed to be pro-mining and the other side that definitely wasn't. But, the vice presidential candidate on the Democrats side, Walz is a former, I guess he's the current governor of Minnesota. He seems to be a little bit more pragmatic in his view of the mining industry and he's actually done some things positive for people like PolyMet.
Yeah, I think pragmatic is a great term for it. I mean, I can't say Governor Waltz is like a huge, industry guy, but he's definitely, but he hasn't been anti-industry either. Before serving as governor of Minnesota, he served as a congressman in Minnesota, and what I would argue a purple district in the southern Minnesota area that covers Mankato and I believe the Rochester area. So he had to work across the aisle for many years during his time in Congress before becoming governor of Minnesota. So he knows how to work across the aisle a little bit. And to your point on the whole, NorthMet thing, before New Range Copper Nickel, there was PolyMet, and PolyMet needed a federal land swap to go through for their project to be a success. So basically, they were giving up some private land. They're trading it for some federal land that encompassed the NorthMet deposit. That was legislation that was pushed through by Democratic Congressman Rick Nolan And from my understanding, I have to double check, but I believe I'm 95% certain that then Congressman Waltz voted with Rick Nolan's legislation on that to help that land swap go through, and eventually went through and went into law, and now. And that's why you see NorthMet being able to work through the permitting process today to make that project a success. On another note, in the oil and gas industry, we had a project called the Line 3 Replacement Project, that runs from Canada to Superior, Wisconsin. It hits a certain part of North Dakota, in northeast North Dakota, about a 30-mile stretch, I believe, before it hits Minnesota. And that had a lot of pushback from environmentalists and NGOs. And even many politicians on Governor Tim Walz's side of the aisle, where Line 3 still got permitted and it still got constructed under his administration. So Tim does have a pretty good, I would say, track record in supporting industry projects. The only other project that I can really touch on is Twin Metals, Minnesota, and there's really nothing he could do with that decision with the mineral lease withdrawal. I wish he would have issued a statement saying that he was against that when that did happen to Twin. But at the same token, that's not up his wheelhouse. That's not his, that's not his decision. So, but overall, I can't say the guy's been horrible for industry. He's been, I think the term that you use is perfect. He's been very pragmatic and, definitely hasn't been an anti-industry governor by any means.
Yeah, and then on the flip side, you have on the Republican side of the aisle, you have former President Trump, who in a recent meeting in Minnesota said he renewed the permits that was Polymet had lost.
Well, and sorry to correct you, Michael. It was actually for Twin. So basically,
sorry.
So no worries. So originally, when Twin Metals mineral leases got taken away, it was under the Obama administration, and then when then President-elect Trump became President Trump, he reinstated the Twin Metals mineral leases, and then within a couple of years of Biden taking office, basically he made the same decision that then President Obama made, which was put a 20-year mining moratorium, that affected the mineral leases for Twin, where they basically can't even go through the permitting process, with exception of the private lands and state lands interests that they have. And in a recent campaign rally, I believe it was in St. Cloud, Minnesota, President Trump was quoted in saying that, if elected, he would reinstate the mineral leases within 10 minutes. I don't know how if it would actually happen within 10 minutes, but given his history and his previous record, I don't see why that wouldn't be the case under a Trump administration. And with that, I hope Harris and Waltz have a similar feeling to that when it comes to this subject.
Yeah, well, one thing to know, it's a close horse race down there, and we're really not sure what's going to happen. And but it's good to see, at least on both sides of this, that there is some acknowledgement that mining is going to be important going forward. So if people want to continue to follow Better in Our Backyard and the good work you do, how would they do so, Ryan?
Obviously, visit our website, but where we stay active is on LinkedIn, Facebook, and then we started to get more active on Twitter, and every once in a while we'll dibby dabble with TikTok. So LinkedIn is where we really have been hitting our sweet spot the last year or two, and then we're still busy on Facebook. So I encourage all of your viewers to follow us if they can, and appreciate you having me on again, Michael.
Not a problem. And as things start to move through Congress on this permitting bill, I'm sure we're going to have you back again soon.
That sounds great, Michael. I appreciate it.
Okay. Thanks for your time, Ryan. The Prospector News podcast is for educational purposes only. The opinions expressed are those of the participants and are not to be taken as investment advice. Listeners need to do their own due diligence and seek advice of a licensed investment advisor.